name is Amy Henderson. It is 11:50. Today's date is September 21st, 2014, and I am conducting an interview with Liz Hawkins for the Quilters S.O.S. Save Our Stories project at the City Quilter in New York City. Thank you for being with me today. Why don't we start off with our touchstone object and tell me about this quilt and why you chose to bring it today.
Well, this quilt is a collaboration with my sister-in-law, my business partner, and we call it Whimsyland. It was for our first book that we did with Kansas City Star. And when we were designing this quilt, we wanted a quilt that kind of captured everything that we loved to work with, the things that we love to do. We love to do applique, that was a given. A lot of the motifs and the things on this quilt you can see in other quilts that we have designed. A staple flower that we use all the time, a cupcake that we love to share together, and we love to use words on our quilts as well. So smile and laugh and live and things that bring us joy. So we wanted something that was really joyful to look at and something that really encompassed everything that we as designers like to design with all the elements. And that's really where it comes from.
What special meaning does this quilt have for you?
I think the meaning that this quilt had, it's a great memory of designing it with my sister-in-law. And we have really fun stories about us designing together, and it's late night, and usually involves chocolate and a lot of caffeine, because we don't live close together, and so we have very limited times that we are together, and those times we take advantage of as much as possible. So we got to a point where we realized that we could go on very little sleep for at least 3, maybe push it to 4 days, and really design together well. And so I think just the laughter and the joy and the fun that we have when we design is what this quilt means for me.
Walk me through the process. You guys don't live in the same cities.
We don't.
You're busy with families, or they're increasingly older kids, but how do you design it? How do you make it? When do you make it? And you don't do it in this 4-day period that you're fueling yourself with
sometimes we do it in the 4-day period. Sometimes we call that a design blitz week. And when Beth was living in Tucson, we liked to do those in the winter because I'm from Pennsylvania. So we would plan those strategically to land in January or March or something when we had a lot of snow in Pennsylvania. So and this one, actually, our families were together, but I think it was around Thanksgiving time. And so we were together for a week and designing projects for our new book. It was our first book, and so it was a little nerve-wracking. We didn't know exactly what we wanted to do, and so it was getting those ideas together and putting them. And I remember just having her design wall up and drawing them out on freezer paper first, drawing out the motifs and kind of placing them in, what do we want to put here? Well, we need another word here. Let's make a fun scallop on the edge, or let's make it a little funky here. We need a little bit of more green here. We wanted a neutral background so that could really, the motifs could really stand out on them. And it was really just a process of, okay, now what does it need? Now what does it need? And adding more as the night wore on. But it was bits and pieces at a time, like a puzzle.
And do you each make the blocks, separate blocks, and pull it all together? Who does the sewing?
Well, when we first started out, we both liked to make one of our quilts because we were crazy. We're like, oh, I love this quilt. I have to have one too. You can't just have one. And plus, we lived on opposite ends of the country, so when we had trunk shows or we were doing things near our area, we didn't have to send the quilts back and forth. So we each have one of these quilts. So we've each made a sample. We also have a very important helper, which is Beth's mom, Carol, whom I lovingly call Mama C because she's not my grandmother, but I've adopted her, or she's adopted me. And she's an amazing quilter. And when we're really in a time crunch, we send it all to Mom C, and she is a fast worker.
So you guys will piece the top.
Piece the top, and then we'll piece the top together, and then this one we sent out for quilting, especially since it was for a book. We didn't want our really bad attempt at quilting to be shown in a book, so we sent this out to the Long Run Quilter.
Tell me a little bit about Lizzie Be Creative. And you guys are design partners.
Mm-hmm.
And how many quilts do you make each year? You make the 2 separate examples for trunk shows. Just tell me a little bit more about your partnership.
Well, as to how many quilts we make here, that's a lot. But we started out as our partnership. First of all, we always thought it would be really fun to go into business together because we have the exact same name. We're both Elizabeth. We both have the middle name Ann. We married brothers, so we're Hawkins as well. And we just thought that would be so funny because we could put one business card, just one name on a business card. We thought, oh, that would be great. And so that's kind of how we started out. And it was interesting when we tried to start the company and make it official. Getting our license and all of that, the license kept coming back, and they would say, you can't be in business with yourself. Because they just saw the 2 names. Even though we had a Pennsylvania driver's license and an Arizona driver's license, totally different pictures. We don't look like twins. So it kept coming back, and we kept sending it back. No, this is a partnership, and they finally figured it out, I guess, and let us become partners. And then other funny things like setting up our bank account when they were talking about our checking account. Well, what order do you want the names on the check? And we said you can just have one name because it's the same. And he's like, oh no, it's a partnership. You have to have 2 names. And so Beth told the bank, well, okay, well then put Elizabeth first and then Elizabeth. And then he kind of got it and went, okay, one name will do. So there were some funny things, and it makes us laugh, and we always get confused. People get confused with who we are. She's always been Beth, I've always been Liz, so we never got confused. We confused our mother-in-law a lot. But so it was never it was never difficult to figure out who each of us was. But it was fun getting started out and working through all of that together and starting the business. And when we were trying to figure out, well, how do you launch a design business into the quilt world? And Beth was working at a quilt store at the time, and she said, oh, well, you need to go to Quilt Market. Everybody goes to Quilt Market. That's where you go. And so for a year, we worked on getting enough quilts ready and patterns ready to take to our first quilt market, which was the next spring in 2007. And I think for starting designers, we had a lot of quilts. I think we had maybe 10, which is, new designers come with 1 or 2, for quilts. We just, our little tiny 10 by 10 booth was packed with quilts and all applique and stuff that we had designed together, inspired by things that we've seen when we were together, and oh, we should make that, or we should do a quilt with that on it, or I haven't seen this, we should do that. And so it was really a fun collaboration.
Tell me about your interest in quilt making. At what age did you start? How did you learn? When did you pick it up?
Well, my story is a little bit different from Beth's, as in I really don't have quilters in my family. My mother did sew a lot, and she had one of those she had a white sewing machine, old, with the treadle, and I remember as a young child sitting underneath it and watching that, or helping her and loving the sound of it. But as I got older, and she would ask me if I wanted to sew something, when I was bored. I'm so bored, I have nothing to do. Oh, why don't you sew something? I thought, you're crazy, I don't want to sew. And so when I actually did start sewing, when I got my first sewing machine as a married woman, she was shocked that I actually wanted to learn how to sew. But it was because I had been introduced to quilting, and I didn't know, I thought, this is a whole other world. I mean, my mom wanted me to sew clothing, and that was the 80s, and even though the 70s were a little bit worse, the 80s fabric was also not so nice. I remember a bumblebee pattern that she tried to get me to use for a t-shirt. Didn't turn out very well. So yeah, I didn't love sewing when I was younger, but when I moved to France, I lived in France for 10 years. We lived in this little town called Villeneuve, and it was right at the bottom of the Jura mountain range, overlooking, our city was Geneva, Switzerland, so we were just outside of Geneva, Switzerland. But France was much more economically, it was just easier to live there. And so we lived in France, and at the end of my street was an American woman who was a quilter, and she gave classes to the English-speaking community. So she was starting a class. I was pregnant with my third child, and I remember meeting all these wonderful women in her class, American, British, German, I mean, just so many women in this class. It was really a fun mix. But she got us together and she said, okay, we're going to learn how to quilt like your grandmother, which means by hand. And I promptly raised my hand. I said, my grandmother was a crocheter, so can I use my sewing machine? And she said no. So I had to learn hand sewing. The interesting part about that, I needed to buy my fabric, and there weren't a lot of places back then to buy fabric in France. I mean, not nice, not good quilting quality fabric. And so we were going back to the United States for a visit, and actually we were going to visit Beth in Alabama. And so I remember shopping for that fabric for my first sampler at about midnight or 1 a.m. at the local Walmart, because it was the only shop they had in town, really, that was open also at 1 a.m. And so we have some funny memories of shopping for that fabric, which, by the way, was also very ugly. So that sampler makes me laugh every time I see it. But so I actually learned we had to do a sampler, and it was, hand stitching pieced blocks, did some applique, they were all traditional blocks. And I remember my little quilt group, my class was meeting the day that I was in the hospital to give birth to my third son, and they were all, oh, she must, talking about me while I was in there. She must be done, right? He must be born by now. And yeah, it took a lot longer than that, but I wish I'd had my quilt with me at the time. I could have been working. But it was fun to learn in that environment and with those women. And after that class ended, we kept getting together as a group of crafters and sewers, and our group got bigger and bigger, and we had knitters, and we would meet once a week to try to encourage each other to finish that sampler at first, and then we'd start new projects and help one another, and it was a really fun place to learn.
Do you have any sense that being in France, when you learned how to make quilts, had an impact on style or design or color, any aesthetics, or how you approach the process?
I think definitely. One, like I said, the fabrics. A lot of the fabrics were they weren't cotton. The quilting cottons were just starting to come into France, and little quilt shops were opening up, and it was very expensive. It was all imported, and so I learned to quilt. I think the second quilt I made was this garden applique quilt, but all the backgrounds were like linens and raw silks and the kinds of fabric that I could find in France. And so it has a very French feel to it for me. And I love those fabrics, and I love that I wasn't kind of already pigeonholed into, you have to use quilting cotton to quilt, and was able to work with lots of different fabrics. And Beth and I love to work with those kinds of fabrics as well, and especially where design comes into play. I think living in France definitely was a inspiration, and inspired by the country and by just the beauty of it. Just don't tell the French, because it just builds their ego a little bit. But it's a really beautiful country, and it was fun to look for things that I could actually build to make me remember the place that I lived.
Do you have a first quilt memory?
Besides the really ugly sampler that I made, the first quilt memory that I have, I remember a quilt that was on my bed as I was growing up, and it was a tulip quilt, applique. And I didn't know anything about it. Later asked my mother who had made it, because I know she was not a quilter, and neither was my grandmother. But it was her aunt who had made it for her and given it to her when she went to college. And it was a beautiful quilt. I remember just loving the soft fabric. It was pink and white and pretty tulips. But I remember what I loved was actually turning it over on my bed and seeing the quilted backside. Like I loved the front, but I thought the back was really interesting, because my mom would come into my room and say, why did you make your bed upside down? But I love that side, Mom, and you could see the flowers, and I thought that was so neat. So that was really my first quilt memory.
Have you ever used quilt making to help you get through a challenging or difficult time in your life?
Oh, absolutely. I think, like Beth said, we turn to it as a therapy, and I think I've had a lot of friends who have suffered from some form of cancer or another, and every time I get that phone call or that, know that somebody is suffering, I go right to my stash. Okay, what can, I need to not just make something for my friend who might need it, but also it's my way of putting all of that love and support that I have for that person into a project that can hopefully help her get through a situation or a hard time. And many times we've done that, and even had a neighbor who had a brain tumor, and I got all my neighbors together they hadn't sewn since the 8th grade, and they were so excited to get together and work on this quilt that we could give to our good friend and neighbor while she was going through her trials with cancer. And so many great stories from those people. That I don't know what I would have done without that quilt wrapped around me, going through chemo or in the hospital. They'd take it with them because it was brightness, it was hope, it was something that meant, it was the love and support of women in their community.
How do quilts tell stories?
I think quilts they're the obvious ones where, this one where you can see, the things that make us happy or want to live a happy life or dream about things. But I think the stories are really in the women who make them, and what they're thinking when they put them in. I have a neighbor who was showing me her antique quilts that her husband's grandmother had made. And she said, oh, I don't get the good quilts because I'm just the in-law, so I just got whatever the sisters didn't want, So she was showing me these quilts, and she showed me this beautiful Dresden plate, made in the 30s. And as I was looking at it, I could see something behind, underneath, and I thought, this is strange, something's wrong with this fabric. And so I had them turn on the light, and I held it up to the light, and you could see a big, huge Texas star underneath. And so I said to her, you didn't get the bummer quilt. You got the quilt with a story, because this woman had to sacrifice another quilt for her Dresden plate quilt top. And, she must not have had the batting, or she didn't have backing, but she wanted to display her new quilt, and so she had used an old one. And I think there are those kinds of stories that quilts tell, and there are the obvious stories that quilts tell in their beauty. And then there are the quilts that like my kids wrap up in and couldn't live without. Or, I love going on a long distance trip and looking in the back of the car, and they're all wrapped up in a different colorful quilt. And that's a story to me. Like, that's their childhood wouldn't be the same without those quilts.
Is there anything I haven't asked you today that you would like us to know about yourself, your process, your interest in quilt making?
I don't think so.
Any advice for future quilt makers as a designer? You're certainly having very public effort and display of your ideas. Anything the future generation should know?
I think just always stay true to your style. I think quilting changes. Actually, I don't think quilting changes a lot. I think the fabrics change. I think we change in what we do and what we like. But I think quilting, if you look, has always stayed the same. You see the same blocks. You see the same, styles. You see those coming all through history. So that doesn't change so much, but we change and our fabrics change. But I think when we find the style that we like, what really makes us happy, that's what shines through, and that's what we leave behind in our quilts. And I think that's what's really important, to stay true to ourselves when we're doing it. It's a work of art. I had an art teacher, my high school art teacher that I went back to, and she had told me that I should go into design way back then. And I said, ugh, that's design, that's math, and I can't do that. And she said, no, you really have an eye for design. And so when I went back and I said, you were right, this is what I do now. And she was just in tears. She's, it's art in fabric. And I thought, you're right. It is art in fabric, and fabric is our medium, and this is the art that we do.
Those are wonderful words. And with that, I'm going to thank you for being part of the Quilters That Save Our Stories interview today. We're concluding at 12:14 p.m. on September 21st, 2014. Thank you, Liz, so much for being part of our interview today.
Thank you.